All right, so I suppose it's impromptu tennis week because Nike has just released two new flagship shoes, the Nike GP Challenge 1 and the Nike GP Challenge Pro, both of them like flagship level shoes, much like the Nike Vapor Pro 2 as well as the Nike Vapor 11. Now what's interesting is in recent years, the Pro version has sold better than the actual numbered model, right? The Nike Vapor Pro 2 sells better than the Nike Vapor 11. So is that potentially going to be the case in the GP Challenge Pro versus GP Challenge 1? Let's get into it. And once again, huge thanks Tennis Warehouse for sending me a pair of the Nike GP Challenge Pros to check out. If you want to pick up a pair for yourself, we'll leave a link in the description below. So, looking at the uppers of the GP Challenge, I mean, yeah, from top to bottom, they do look like the GP Turbo. It does have this really aggressive drag guard here. It's pretty tough rubber material. The only thing is that it doesn't extend that far into the midfoot of the shoe. So if you are a super everter or you have a really big bunion, you still might be someone that can get some wear here. If you are a traditional dragger slider like most people, this should do you just fine. If you look at it on the upper durability test, 10 seconds highest grit sandpaper, I mean, the burr barely scuffs this thing. So it is pretty darn tough. So I'd say anybody that's not a super everter or kind of uses their midfoot to drag, you should be okay. When I first looked at the GP Challenge, I saw all this meshing on the outside of it, this really, big bed of macro meshing. And I thought to myself, this might have a lot of breathability, except for the fact that when you look underneath of the shoe, it is almost like molded underneath of there. The meshing gets really tight. It's 2 layers, plus you do get a really aggressive gusset, which it's great for lockdown, and you get a terry lining around the rear foot of the shoe and the tongue, which phenomenal for comfort. It's just that all of that kind of builds on each other to really trap heat. Because if you look at the breathability test, things heated up 170.1 degrees and then cooled down 96.4 degrees. The really weird part is when I did the breathability mapping on this, all the air was coming out of the tongue, and that's the thing that's backed with terry cloth underneath of it. So at least the terry material is breathing. The rest of it, because it's that really tight meshing underneath of it, almost like a waxy meshing underneath, I think is just trapping so much air in there. So you are getting most of your breathability through the tongue. On the lateral side, you do get that molding, so there's really no air coming through there. However, on the medial side, you could feel a little bit of heat penetrating through there, but when you get the double reinforcement on the toe cap plus all the molding on the lateral side, which we'll see in a minute is a pretty big asset, you have to sacrifice something somewhere. The thing about the uppers I think I like most though is the lace line of these things. Number one, it's double reinforced, which I love. Number two is the reinforcement goes all the way into this lateral container, which really does give a lot more lateral stability, especially for a shoe, which we'll see in the midsole, that is propped up a little bit. So, you are getting a decent lockdown for a shoe that does not have a super high backed heel counter, plus that terry material kind of keeps pretty comfortable under there. The tongue is super padded, as we saw in the breathability test. So in terms of lockdown, comfort, and stability, these are some of the better uppers I have seen recently. It's the breathability that you kind of have to trade off with. If you were waiting for a shoe to pick up where the GP Turbo's midsole left off, well, then you're probably gonna have to wait for the GP Challenge 1 potentially, because the GP Challenge Pro, much more akin to the Court Pro or the Court Next. In the rear foot, you got a rear foot loaded Zoom air unit. Then you've got that springboard plate, which we've seen in some recent Nike tennis models, that semi-constrained shank, which I kind of like. It's a little bit more flexible. It feels pretty comfortable underfoot for where it is stacked in the midsole foam, and the rest of the shoe you just have a traditional Phylon midsole setup. Now in the forefoot, you are going to get a little bit more court feel versus having air underneath of you. However, if you like the GP line, you like that really thick, just pillow of air underneath of your foot. The one thing the GP Challenge Pro does have that the GP Turbo does not is 2 lateral flanges. One here in the forefoot, which is really wide and just chunky, and then one here in the rear foot, which is just as chunky and wide. This shoe, like the GP Turbo, looks like it's up here on a platform, right? So it looks like it might be a little bit more of an unstable shoe. It's not. So you're still getting, the level of foam here. You're still getting that Zoom air unit in the rear foot, but this shoe just has a little bit more side-to-side containment versus the GP Turbo. And because there's just, that foam setup in the forefoot of these things, yeah, they do have a little bit more court feel than the GP Turbo did. It's not as pillowy and springy in the forefoot either, but different strokes for different folks, I guess. The one thing that was really interesting to me about the midsole was the bounce height test. Now, that rear foot Zoom Air unit is a little thinner. That got 33 centimeters. The forefoot got 32. And you can see, the slab of foam in the forefoot is pretty high stacked. So it really shows you it's the Phylon in this shoe that's doing a lot of the work, that Zoom Air unit, I think, because it's not really connected to anything rigid. Remember, that springboard plate is pretty flexible, so there's really not a lot that it has to bounce off of, right? When you hit that ball bearing down on there, it's really just kind of compressing into the Phylon versus something that may be connected to more rigid parts of the shoe where it can kind of rebound really easily. So I found it interesting that even though there isn't zoom in the forefoot, you are still getting a decent amount of bounce on the forefoot from the ball bearing. How much that actually translates to a human foot in there, we'll talk about in a second. The one thing that surprised me was how middle of the road the tread was between, sliding and forgiveness versus grip, even on some of these white painted lines that get really slick. Now, as you can see, this is one big circular herringbone, which means, it goes in one continuous pattern around the shoe of herringbone. It is, a continuous tread pattern. And then because those flanges, like we talked about, are so wide, you get tread all the way out here. It's just a really wide based shoe for something that looks like it's, so much on a platform. It's kind of weird. However, if you look at the grip test ramp on these things, they slipped at 38 degrees, which is pretty middle of the road for shoes and kind of correlated, really well out here on court. I did notice that, if I wanted to lay a little less weight down, they would slide. If I wanted to put my weight down, they would grip. Now, I wouldn't go be trying to put these on a slick carpet or even clay because that razor shaped herringbone pattern gets very, very, very narrow. And if you do start sliding on this a lot, this will probably start to look bald because the rubber will start to meld into itself pretty quickly. So just kind of watch out for that profile. However, on a medium fast, medium grit hard court, these things are pretty much going to fit really anybody's type of, movement style. The other thing that is super middle of the road about the GP Challenge Pro is its speed. You look at the speed ratio, comes in at a 2.11 with a shank score of 0.2 because it is top loaded and there is a shank there. But so that will come in at a 2.31. So to me, that's pretty representative because it is a pretty middle of the road speed type shoe. That shank is not super rigid. You're not getting a super diving board effect out of these. To me, I think the biggest advantage of these shoes is that you have a decent stack of foam in the forefoot for cushion, but you also get a decent amount of ground contact and ground feel on these. And because the midsole is so chunky on the lateral side, you're not becoming unstable. To me, these things don't have a ton of launch. They're much more flexible of a shoe. So I think in terms of speed, the speed comes from confidence and comfort on these, not necessarily the launch you're getting. But like I said, for a shoe that does put you up a little bit higher off the ground, you can go side to side pretty quick and have pretty decent confidence with it. It's just that it's the front to back and it's the long range speed on these things I think some people will be missing. And speaking of all that speed you're going to be creating and all that friction you're going to be creating, look at the outsole durability test, 10 seconds highest grit sandpaper. Not even a millimeter of damage on this. The durometer is pretty high on these. Like I said, the only bad thing about this is that this is going to start melding together these treads where it gets really thin if you are producing a lot of friction. So I'd say for a shoe that provides enough sliding potential and enough grip potential, these are going to be at least decently durable for you. So I think one of the weirdest parts of the GP Challenge Pro is its fit. It comes in at a 9.1 centimeter metatarsal width and then, pretty standard 28.7 centimeter length, which is, like I said, pretty standard. It's just that the midfoot, when you pull out the insole even, you can see the midfoot gets so narrow on these. So if you're somebody with prominent styloid process, really bulky midfoot, you're gonna feel the crunch in these, even if, the forefoot in these isn't the most narrow we've ever seen. I know with me, I could start to feel a little bit of cramping just kind of walking around in them until I did break them in a little bit. Because it is a lot of mesh on the medial side will break in. It's just the lateral side with that molding. is gonna get, you know, it's gonna stay pretty narrow. So I'd say narrow, medium foot, you can just go true to size on these things. A 2E, I probably would be going up that 1/2 size on them. A 4E, might just be a little bit of a mismatch, and somebody maybe with a prominent styloid or just really bulky midfoot might just be a mismatch on these. If more of your width is in the forefoot, it's going to be easier and easier the more distal the width of your foot is. But I would say in terms of heel pain, Achilles tendonitis, shock-induced injuries in the rear foot, as well as arch strain, arch pain, these really aren't the worst things in the world. The Zoom Air unit in the rear foot is pretty plush feeling. You can feel it underfoot. And because the shoe has that really posterior rocker, it is pretty darn forgiving in the rear foot. Now, if that rocker was any bit further forward, it would just introduce so much instability into the shoe. It would be, you know, horrible for really any rear foot or any kind of instability type issues. Whereas in this one, because it's got the lateral flange in the rear foot as well as in the forefoot, and they are both super chunky, this is actually a decently stable shoe for how much of a platform it does sit on, right? So, you know, I would say anything snake bitten in the rear foot's gonna be okay. As you start to get further into the forefoot, that's gonna start to get more of the issues. I'd say anything forefoot pain in these, a low profile, a rigid orthotic that can kind of hold the midfoot open is going to make these better. But in terms of a ball of foot pain type shoe, these aren't the greatest things in the market, but like I said, with an orthotic, that they will at least get a little bit better and better. In terms of the on-court performance, the Challenge Pro, you know, they're not the GP turbos. You know, is that a good thing or a bad thing? I think that's gonna, you know, the beauty is gonna be in the eye of the beholder. These things are really laterally stable, which I like, and they feel really chunky underfoot, especially on the heel. They really do feel pretty darn pillowy, right? For just, you know, having a pretty standard Nike foam setup. That springboard plate does make you feel pretty comfortable moving side to side. These things do not create any feelings of like rigidity underneath of your foot. They still do feel pretty just forgiving. Do they feel super lively? No, they're much more like the Nike Vapor Pro 2 or the Vapor 11 in terms of their feel. The nice thing about these is unlike the Vapor Pro 2 and the Vapor 11, they are still very bottom stable without being super bottom heavy, right? You know, they don't have that feeling that those other two do. I would say these are a pretty just middle of the road shoe. They're not bad by any means. Are they like the paradigm shifting shoe that at least I thought the GP Turbo was? No, but they are still a solid shoe for where Nike kind of placed them in their lineup. And I think a lot of people are probably gonna like them mainly for the chunky lateral flanges on them, really, and for kind of the pillowy nature of the heel with the court feel of the forefoot, as well as the ability to kind of pretty much choose your own adventure in terms of grip. I think in terms of an all-court shoe, they're gonna be pretty nice because as the shoe breaks in, they're gonna get more and more flexible, and you can kind of maybe get just a little bit more degrees of freedom in there versus some other shoes in its class. And I think some people that are more serve and volleyers or doubles players that really want that more flexible shank in the shoe, but also some support are gonna like it too. I think in terms of pickleball, these are also a pretty nice shoe. Like I said, because the lateral flanges, they are really laterally stable. And like I said, flexibility in the midsole, but also a little bit more support. So like I said, an all around kind of tweener type shoe, more middle of the road shoe in most instances. I am looking forward to seeing what else Nike has up their sleeve for this year. And you know, we'll kind of go from there. But I would love to hear your thoughts on the GP Challenge Pro. Have you like really been itching to get these? You know, are these already in your shopping cart, or are you waiting for another model to come on down the line? Let me know in the comments down below. And if you want to see one of the older siblings to the GP Challenge Pro, the Nike Vapor 11 Mac Attack colorway, which is a pretty different shoe from the Nike Vapor 11, make sure you click into this video up above and subscribe down below. Respect your rubber and foam. I'll see you somewhere in the sneakerverse.